What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a talk show expecting a normal interview, only to be blindsided by a host spiraling into ego-driven chaos? In just 49 seconds of one comment, Jon Stewart would ignite a confrontation so explosive that it would end with Samuel L. Jackson walking off the set, leaving the audience in complete shock, and Stewart scrambling to salvage what was left of his crumbling authority. It started like any other late-night interview. Samuel L. Jackson walked out onto the stage, waving to the roaring audience, that signature confident stride carrying him to the guest chair. The crowd was electric. They loved him. He settled into his seat, flashed that charismatic smile, and prepared for what he thought would be a fun conversation about his latest film. Stewart opened with the usual pleasantries, asking about the movie, the action sequences, working with the cast. Jackson answered with his typical blend of cool professionalism and humor, getting laughs from the crowd, keeping the energy light. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The interview was flowing smoothly. The audience was engaged. Jackson was relaxed. Then something shifted. Stewart leaned back in his chair, a strange smirk crossing his face. The kind of look that signals someone is about to say something they think is clever but really isn't. He glanced at his notes, then back at Jackson, and the tone in his voice changed completely. "So Sam," Stewart said, drawing out the name in a way that immediately felt disrespectful, "I gotta ask you something. Do you ever get tired of playing the same angry black guy in every single movie?" The audience went quiet. You could feel the air get sucked out of the room. Jackson's expression didn't change right away, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. He tilted his head as if he couldn't believe what he just heard. "Excuse me?" Jackson said, his voice calm, but with an edge that anyone paying attention would recognize as a warning. Stewart, either oblivious or simply not caring, pressed forward. "Come on, you know what I mean. The tough guy, the guy who yells a lot, drops some curse words, shoots some guns. It's like, we get it. You're intense. But don't you ever want to, I don't know, play a librarian or something?" The audience sat perfectly still, staring at Stewart with an intensity that could cut through steel. "A librarian," Jackson repeated slowly, his voice flat. "You think that's what I should be doing?" "I'm just saying," Stewart continued, that smirk still plastered on his face, like he thought he was being edgy and provocative. "Maybe it's time to switch it up. Show some range. Because right now, it kind of feels like you're just cashing checks and phoning it in." The audience gasped. Actual gasps. This wasn't playful ribbing. This wasn't comedy. This was a host, on his own show, disrespecting a guest who had done nothing to deserve it. Jackson leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together, and he spoke with the kind of controlled precision that comes right before someone loses their patience entirely. "Let me make sure I understand what you just said," Jackson began, his voice low and measured. "You're sitting here, on your show, telling me, a man who has been acting for decades, who has worked on everything from independent films to major blockbusters, who has played everything from crack addicts to Jedis to Shakespearean characters, that I have no range. Is that what you're telling me?" Stewart shifted in his seat, clearly starting to realize he might have crossed a line, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "I mean, when's the last time you did something really different? Something that wasn't just you being, Samuel L. Jackson?" "Something that wasn't me being Samuel L. Jackson," Jackson repeated, and now there was no mistaking the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You do realize that statement makes absolutely no sense, right? I am Samuel L. Jackson. Everything I do is me being Samuel L. Jackson." The audience started clapping, small bursts of support for Jackson, sensing that he was the one being wronged here. Stewart glanced at them, irritated that they weren't on his side, and that irritation made him even more reckless. "Look, all I'm saying is, maybe you're stuck in a box," Stewart said, his voice taking on a condescending tone, like he was explaining something simple to someone who didn't understand. Maybe you've gotten comfortable. Maybe you've forgotten what it's like to actually challenge yourself as an actor. I mean, when was the last time you really stretched yourself? When was the last time you did something that scared you? The audience was getting more uncomfortable by the second. People were shifting in their seats, exchanging glances, wondering why Stewart was doing this. This wasn't entertainment. This was cringe-inducing. Jackson laughed. Not a real laugh, but one of those laughs that says, "I cannot believe what I'm hearing right now." He shook his head slowly, looking out at the audience as if to say, "Are you all seeing this?" "You want to talk about stretching myself," Jackson said, his voice dripping with controlled frustration. "Let me tell you something about my career, since you clearly haven't been paying attention. I've done dramatic roles that made people cry. I've done comedies that made people laugh. I've done action films, sure, because I'm good at them and people enjoy watching them. I've done independent films for scale when I believed in the story. I've done theater. I've done voice work. I've done everything there is to do in this industry." Stewart tried to interrupt. "I'm not saying you haven't done different things. I'm just saying lately it seems like you're—" "No." Jackson cut him off sharply. "You don't get to backtrack now. You said what you said. You told me I was phoning it in. You told me I was cashing checks. You told me I had no range. Those were your words, not mine. So now you're going to sit there and listen to what I have to say." The audience erupted in applause. They were completely behind Jackson now, and you could see Stewart's face redden with embarrassment and anger at losing control of his own show. "I don't need to justify my career choices to you or to anyone," Jackson continued, his voice rising slightly. "I've earned my place in this industry through decades of hard work. I've worked with the best directors in the world. I've been nominated for awards. I've won awards. I've inspired people. I've entertained millions. And I've done it all while maintaining my integrity and staying true to myself." Stewart's mouth was set in a thin line. He was trying to maintain his composure, but it was clear he was rattled. "Look, Sam, I think you're taking this way too personally." "Taking it too personally?" Jackson repeated incredulously. "You insult me on national television and I'm taking it too personally? What exactly did you expect me to do? Smile and nod while you disrespect me?" "You think I've forgotten what it's like to challenge myself," Jackson said, turning back to Stewart. "You, a talk show host who sits behind a desk and reads jokes other people write for you, are going to lecture me about challenging myself. You, who interviews celebrities and occasionally does a segment making fun of politicians, are going to tell me, someone who has built an entire career on taking risks and pushing boundaries, that I need to challenge myself more." The audience erupted. Cheers, applause, shouts of support. They were fully on Jackson's side now, and Stewart knew it. His face flushed red, and instead of gracefully moving on, instead of apologizing, instead of doing literally anything to de-escalate, he made it worse. "Hey, at least I don't just coast on attitude and catchphrases," Stewart shot back, his voice rising. "At least I actually have to think about what I'm doing every night. At least I'm not just showing up, saying some cool lines, and collecting a paycheck." The audience booed. Actually booed. Their own host. Some people were shouting at Stewart to stop, to apologize, to just end this disaster. But he was too far gone, too deep into his own defensiveness to pull back now. Jackson sat back in his chair, nodding slowly, a cold smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. The smile of someone who had just watched another person destroy themselves. "Coast on attitude and catchphrases," Jackson said quietly, almost to himself. Then louder, "You know what, Jon? I came here tonight to talk about my work. To have a good time, maybe make some people laugh. I came here as a professional, expecting to be treated like a professional. But instead, you decided to sit there and insult me for no reason. You decided to disrespect me in front of all these people. You decided that tearing me down would somehow make you look clever or edgy or whatever it is you were going for. I wasn't insulting you, Stewart said defensively, but his voice cracked slightly. I was just trying to have an honest conversation. I was trying to get past the usual promotional nonsense and have a real discussion. An honest conversation? Jackson repeated, standing up now. The audience went completely silent. Every eye locked on him. This was the moment. This was when it all fell apart. An honest conversation would be you acknowledging that you clearly have some kind of problem with me, or with the roles I choose, or with something, and instead of being professional about it, you decided to ambush me on your show. An honest conversation would have started with respect, not with insults. Stewart stood up too, trying to regain some control of the situation. He was visibly flustered now, sweat forming on his forehead. Sam, come on, don't be so sensitive. It's just a conversation. We're just talking. This is what I do. I push back. I challenge people. That's the whole point of having guests on. Otherwise, what's the point? Don't call me sensitive, Jackson said, his voice sharp as a blade, cutting through Stewart's excuses. Don't you dare sit there and insult me and then tell me I'm being sensitive for calling you out on it. That's what people do when they know they're wrong, but they're too proud to admit it. They blame the other person for having a normal human reaction to being disrespected. The tension was suffocating. The camera operators didn't know where to point. The audience was frozen. Stewart's smugness was gone, replaced by panic. Look, maybe I phrased things badly, Stewart said, trying to sound reasonable, but coming off as desperate. Maybe I didn't say what I meant the right way. Maybe we can start over. No, you said exactly what you meant, Jackson replied, his voice cold and clear. You meant to be disrespectful. You meant to try and tear me down. You meant to make yourself look clever at my expense. And you know what the really sad part is? You did it because you thought it would be funny. You thought your audience would laugh along with you while you mocked your guest. You thought this would be a moment people would remember and applaud. Jackson gestured to the audience. But they're not laughing, Jon. Nobody's laughing. Because what you did wasn't funny. It was mean. It was small. It was petty. And it was completely uncalled for. These people came here for entertainment, not to watch you bully a guest. Stewart opened his mouth to respond, but Jackson held up a hand. I'm done here, Jackson said simply. He started to remove his microphone, unclipping it from his shirt with steady hands. The action was so final, so definitive, that it sent a wave of gasps through the audience. Wait, Sam, come on, Stewart said, and now he was pleading, his voice taking on a desperate quality. He was realizing that this was actually happening, that his guest was actually leaving, that this nightmare was spiraling completely out of his control. Don't leave. Let's talk about this. Let's work this out. We can get past this. There's nothing to work out, Jackson said, placing the microphone on his chair with deliberate care. You showed me exactly who you are tonight, and I have no interest in sitting here and being your punching bag for another second. I have no interest in pretending that what you did was okay, just to save face for your show. The audience burst into applause, standing up, giving Jackson a standing ovation as he prepared to walk off. People were clapping, cheering, some even whistling their support. Stewart stood there, looking out at his own audience, cheering for his guest and against him, the reality of what he'd done finally sinking in. His face had gone from red to pale, the color draining as he understood just how badly he'd miscalculated. This is ridiculous, Stewart muttered, trying one last desperate move, his voice taking on an angry edge. You're being ridiculous. You're overreacting to a simple conversation. This is exactly what's wrong with celebrities today. You can't handle any criticism. You can't handle anyone questioning you. Jackson stopped dead in his tracks, turned back to face Stewart one final time, and the look on his face was pure controlled fury, the kind that comes from years of dealing with people who think they can say whatever they want without consequences. No, Jon, what's ridiculous is that you had one of the biggest stars in the world on your show, someone who has entertained millions of people, someone who has worked with legends, someone who has earned respect in this industry, and instead of treating him with the basic respect any guest deserves, you decided to act like a spoiled child who thinks being edgy is the same thing as being intelligent. What's ridiculous is that you're so caught up in your own ego, so convinced of your own cleverness, that you can't even see how badly you just embarrassed yourself in front of everyone here. Jackson took a breath, but he wasn't done. The words kept coming, each one landing like a hammer blow. You want to talk about criticism? I've been criticized by the best. I've been criticized by real film critics, by directors, by people who actually know what they're talking about. And you know what? I listen when it's valid. I listen when it comes from a place of genuine insight. But what you did tonight wasn't criticism. It was a cheap shot. It was you trying to get a reaction, trying to create a moment without any regard for the human being sitting across from you. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Some people had their hands over their mouths in shock. Others were nodding in agreement. All of them understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. And the worst part, Jackson continued, his voice dropping lower, but somehow more powerful, is that you don't even understand why what you did was wrong. You think I'm overreacting. You think I'm being too sensitive. But the truth is, you crossed a line. And when I called you on it, you couldn't handle it. You couldn't handle being held accountable for your own words. With that, Samuel L. Jackson turned and walked off the stage. The audience cheered louder, many of them standing, clapping, shouting their support. Some were even booing Stewart now, making their disapproval crystal clear. Stewart stood alone at his desk, his hands gripping the edge, his face pale. He looked out at the audience, then at the cameras, then down at his desk. For a long moment, he said nothing. The cheers for Jackson continued, echoing through the studio, a reminder of just how completely he had lost the room. One of the producers rushed out, whispering something in Stewart's ear. He nodded stiffly, then looked back at the camera with a forced, painful smile. "We're going to take a quick break," he said, his voice strained. "We'll be right back." But nobody was thinking about what would happen after the break. Everyone was thinking about what had just happened, about how a host had sabotaged his own show, about how he had disrespected a guest so thoroughly that the guest had no choice but to leave, about how the audience, his own audience, had turned on him. In the backstage area, Jackson was immediately surrounded by staff members apologizing profusely, others asking if he was okay. A young production assistant approached with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Jackson. That was so unprofessional." Jackson gave her a kind smile. "It's not your fault. Don't apologize for someone else's behavior." "I'm fine," he told the staff, "but you might want to talk to your host about how to treat people." One of the senior producers stepped forward. "Mr. Jackson, what happened tonight does not represent this show." Jackson nodded. "I appreciate that, but it did happen, and everyone saw it." Back on the stage, Stewart sat at his desk during the commercial break, his head in his hands, fingers gripping his hair. Members of his team gathered around him, but nobody seemed to know what to say. The silence was deafening. What could they say? He had imploded on live television. He had turned what should have been a simple, fun interview into a complete disaster entirely of his own making. His head writer stood nearby, arms crossed. The makeup person had stopped trying to fix his appearance. The floor manager kept glancing at his watch. When someone finally spoke, it was one of the newer writers. "What were you thinking?" Stewart sat there, staring at his desk. He hadn't been thinking. He'd been performing, trying to be provocative without considering the human being across from him. "I thought," Stewart finally said, his voice hoarse, "I thought I was being interesting." "You thought wrong," the head writer said. "You were being a jerk to one of the most beloved actors in the world." The stage manager counted down to them coming back from commercial. Stewart straightened up, tried to compose himself, but you could see it in his eyes. He knew he'd crossed a line. They came back on air, and Stewart faced the camera, the audience still buzzing with energy from what they'd witnessed. You could hear people whispering to each other, still processing what had just happened, still shocked. "So, Stewart began, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. His voice cracked slightly. "That happened." A few awkward laughs from the audience, but mostly silence. They were waiting. Would he apologize? Would he double down? Would he try to make a joke? "Look," Stewart continued, rubbing his face with his hand, "sometimes conversations get heated. Sometimes things get said that maybe come out wrong. Sometimes in the moment, you're trying to have an interesting discussion, and it goes in a direction you didn't expect." But even as he spoke, you could hear how hollow it sounded, how insufficient. He wasn't taking responsibility. He was making excuses, trying to frame it as a mutual misunderstanding, rather than what it was. And the audience could tell. They could hear the difference between a real apology and damage control. Someone in the crowd shouted, "You were out of line." Another voice chimed in, "Apologize properly." A third person yelled, "That was disrespectful." Stewart's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged by his audience. He wasn't used to being the bad guy in his own show. He wasn't used to his own crowd turning on him. The discomfort was written all over his face, in every line, every nervous gesture. "I hear you," he said stiffly, the words coming out forced and insincere. "I hear you, and I'll think about what happened tonight." But even that wasn't an apology. It was another dodge, another way of avoiding actually saying the words "I was wrong." "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that." But it was too late. The damage was done. Samuel L. Jackson had walked off his show, and everyone watching knew exactly why. They'd seen Stewart's arrogance. They'd seen his disrespect. They'd seen him treat a guest like garbage for no reason other than his own inflated sense of self-importance. Meanwhile, Jackson was already in his car, leaving the studio, watching the building disappear in the rearview mirror. He sat in the back seat, looking out the window at the city lights passing by, the familiar streets at night, thinking about what had just happened, replaying it, not with anger anymore, but with weary resignation. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of people thinking they could treat him however they wanted because he was a public figure. Tired of hosts who thought being controversial was more important than being decent. Tired of having to stand up for himself in situations where he should never have been put in that position. His phone buzzed once, then again. Then it didn't stop. Text messages flooding in from friends, colleagues, people who had been in the audience or heard about what happened. The story was already spreading through the industry. From his agent, "Just heard what happened. You handled that perfectly. Stewart made a complete fool of himself." From a fellow actor, "Saw a clip already online. Cannot believe he said that to you. You have every right to walk." From a director he'd worked with, "That took guts. Respect. Nobody should have to sit there and take that." From another actor, "Standing ovation from me. That's how you handle a bully." Messages kept coming. People saying he'd done the right thing. People expressing shock at Stewart's behavior. People sharing their own stories of times they'd been disrespected but hadn't felt like they could speak up. Jackson read a few of them, appreciating the support, even though he didn't need validation. Then he put his phone away, letting it buzz silently in his pocket. He didn't need other people to tell him he'd handled it correctly. He knew. He'd stood up for himself with dignity and strength, and he'd left when it became clear that staying would only enable more disrespect. He'd drawn a line and refused to let anyone cross it. That was exactly what he should have done. That was what anyone should do when faced with that kind of treatment. Back at the studio, Stewart struggled through the rest of the show. Every joke fell flat. Every segment felt awkward. The energy was completely gone, sucked out by that confrontation. The audience sat there, polite but distant, their enthusiasm killed by what they'd witnessed. When the show finally ended, Stewart walked off stage without saying goodbye to anyone. He went straight to his dressing room and closed the door. Inside, he sat on the couch, staring at nothing, replaying the interview in his mind. He'd thought he was being clever. He'd thought he was being interesting. But he'd just been cruel. He'd punched down at someone who didn't deserve it. His executive producer knocked on the door, came in without waiting for an answer. "We need to talk about what just happened," she said. Stewart nodded slowly. "I know. That was bad, Jon. That was really bad." "I know," Stewart said again, quieter this time. Out in the parking lot, the audience members were leaving, and their conversations were all about the same thing. About Jackson's dignity. About Stewart's rudeness. About how uncomfortable it had been to watch. Some of them were already posting about it online, sharing their accounts, their opinions, their disbelief. The story was spreading rapidly, and in every version, the narrative was the same. Samuel L. Jackson had been the professional. Jon Stewart had been the antagonist. Inside his car, now far from the studio, Jackson received a call from his agent. "I heard what happened," his agent said. "You handled it perfectly. The whole industry is talking about it." Jackson nodded, even though his agent couldn't see him. "I just don't understand why he thought that was okay. Why he thought he could speak to me that way." "Some people let the platform go to their head," his agent said. "They forget their guests are human beings. They forget that respect goes both ways." That was it exactly. Stewart had treated him like content rather than a person, and when Jackson had refused to play along, Stewart had completely fallen apart. The night wore on. The show was over. The audience had gone home. But the impact of those few minutes would linger. People had seen something raw and real. They'd seen what happens when ego collides with dignity. They'd seen a man stand up for himself when it would have been easier to just sit there and take it. And most importantly, they'd seen very clearly who the good guy was. Samuel L. Jackson had walked onto that stage with good intentions, ready to have a pleasant conversation. Jon Stewart had turned it into a confrontation through his own actions, his own words, his own inability to show basic respect. In the end, it was a simple story about respect, about boundaries, about what happens when someone crosses a line they shouldn't cross. It was about a man who knew his worth and refused to let anyone diminish it, no matter the circumstances. And it was about a host who learned, in the most public way possible, that having a platform doesn't give you the right to treat people poorly. That being on television doesn't mean you can say whatever you want without consequences. The cameras had captured it all. Every word, every expression, every moment. And now it was out there, a permanent record of what happened when Jon Stewart decided to go after Samuel L. Jackson for no good reason. And Jackson decided he'd had enough. A record that would be replayed, discussed, analyzed. A moment that would define how people saw both men. One who maintained his dignity under fire. One who lost his way completely.